The smell of roasted chicken lingered in the kitchen, heavy with garlic and thyme. Plates clinked, silverware scraped, and laughter carried across the table. For a moment, it almost felt like any other Sunday dinner. Almost. Then my son leaned back in his chair, his fork still in his hand, and said the words that sliced deeper than any knife. "I don't want to feed an extra mouth anymore." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried. It landed like a hammer on the oak table, and suddenly, the room fell silent. My daughter-in-law pressed her lips together, half smiling, half pleased. The grandchildren looked down at their plates, eyes wide. I froze, the bite of potato halfway to my mouth. For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard him. Maybe the clatter of the kitchen, the hum of the fridge, had twisted his words. But no. His eyes met mine, cold, firm, businesslike. He wasn't joking. I set the fork down slowly. The metal clicked against the plate, louder than it should have been. No one spoke. Even the laughter that had filled the air seconds ago vanished like smoke. He went on. "Dad, we can't keep covering for you. Food's expensive. Bills are high. You're just another mouth to feed." The words were simple, almost casual. Like he was discussing a grocery list. But each syllable pressed into me with the weight of a lifetime. I looked around the table. My chair was at the end, always had been, since the house was mine. The photos on the wall were of me, my late wife, and the boy who now spoke to me like I was a stranger. The boy I had raised. The boy whose tuition I had worked overtime for. The boy I had trusted to carry on the family name. Now he looked at me as if I were a burden. I felt the sting, sharp and bitter, but I didn't let it show. My back stayed straight. My hands didn't tremble. I smiled. Just a thin smile, nothing more. "All right," I said quietly. No one knew it yet, but in that silence, a decision had been made. And it wasn't mine that would break. The house was never quiet when my wife was alive. She filled it with humming, old country songs, half-forgotten hymns, whatever came to her lips while she cooked or dusted. Even the silence back then had warmth. Now, the silence was sharp. That night after dinner, I sat alone in the living room. The others had gone upstairs, their laughter muffled behind closed doors. From where I sat, I could hear the faint echo of a television, the creak of floorboards, the slam of a bedroom door. Every sound reminded me that the house no longer belonged to me, even though my name was still on the deed. The chair I sat in had been mine for decades, brown leather, worn on the arms where my hands used to rest after long shifts at work. Tonight, it felt like a seat reserved for a guest who had overstayed his welcome. On the mantel above the fireplace, our family photos stared back. My wife in her favorite dress, my son with his arm around me, grinning like he had the world at his feet. I studied that photo until my eyes blurred. The boy in the picture and the man who had spoken at the dinner table, they weren't the same. A gust of winter wind rattled the windows. It cut through the thin walls, colder than I remembered. I pulled my sweater tighter, but the chill came from more than the draft. I thought of everything I had given, the mortgage payments, the double shifts, the nights I went hungry so my son could eat. And yet, in his eyes, I had become nothing but an extra mouth. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. The wound was deeper than that, quiet, invisible, but heavy enough to bend a man's shoulders. Down the hallway, I heard my son's voice again, muffled through a door. He was speaking to his wife, low, hurried, irritated. Words drifted through, responsibility. Bills. Dead weight. I leaned back in the leather chair, closing my eyes. They thought I was finished. Let them think it. The silence was mine, and I would hold it. For now. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of burnt toast. My daughter-in-law was rushing the kids through breakfast, snapping at them to hurry. My son sat at the counter with his coffee, scrolling on his phone. He didn't look up when I entered, just muttered, "Sit down, Dad. We need to talk." I lowered myself onto the stool across from him. His eyes never softened. He slid the phone across the counter, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. An online job listing stared back at me. Part-time janitor. Evening shift. Minimum wage. "I found you something," he said. "It's not much, but at least you can cover your own expenses. You know, pull your weight." The words were sharp, but his tone was casual, like he was doing me a favor. I glanced at the screen, then at him. He waited, arms crossed, a look of finality in his eyes. His wife leaned against the sink, smirking as if she'd already won a battle. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him that the house he lived in was mine. I didn't mention the years of sacrifice, the overtime shifts, the missed meals so he could have what he wanted. None of it mattered to him anymore. Instead, I let the silence stretch. I picked up the phone, studied the listing. "Janitor," I said softly. He nodded quickly, almost relieved. "Yeah. Simple stuff. Sweep floors, take out trash, clean bathrooms. The manager said they'd give you a chance. You start Monday." The humiliation settled deep in my chest, but I didn't let it show. My smile was thin, almost polite. "All right," I said. "Monday it is." His shoulders dropped, tension easing. My daughter-in-law turned back to the sink, satisfied. They thought they had solved a problem, cutting down their bills, making me someone else's responsibility. But what they didn't understand was that every insult, every command, every dismissal only sharpened something inside me. I had been a worker all my life. Cleaning floors wasn't beneath me. Survival was never beneath me. What was beneath them was gratitude. I folded the phone shut and handed it back. "Thank you," I said evenly. And for the first time, I meant it. Not for the job. For the reminder. Monday came gray and damp. The sky hung low over the city, a lid of heavy clouds pressing down. I buttoned my old coat, the same one I'd worn for years, and stepped out into the cold. No one wished me luck. No one even looked up as I left the house. The janitor's uniform waited in a plastic bag at the front desk of the community center. A thin blue shirt, stiff with starch, and a name tag that simply read staff. The manager, a man half my age, handed it over without meeting my eyes. "Bathrooms first," he said, already walking away. The smell of bleach and old tile clung to the air. I rolled up my sleeves and started scrubbing. The mop handle was rough against my palms, the bucket water icy even through gloves. Every sweep of the mop echoed in the empty hallway. Some workers passed by. Most didn't notice me. A few looked, then quickly looked away. To them, I was invisible, another old man trying to stretch a few dollars before retirement. But I wasn't ashamed. I had done harder work. I lifted steel beams when my back was strong, fixed broken engines in the dead of winter, carried more weight than this mop would ever give me. Cleaning floors didn't break me. Being called an extra mouth had hurt more than the bleach in my hands ever could. Late in the shift, a little boy ran past, dragging his backpack, sneakers squeaking on the polished tile I just cleaned. He stopped, glanced at me, and said softly, "Thanks, mister." 2 words. Just that. And it was more respect than I'd been given at home in months. When I left the building that night, my back ached and my clothes smelled of disinfectant. But as I walked through the cold air, I straightened my shoulders. They thought sending me here was punishment. They didn't see that work, any work, was never beneath me. The lesson was not mine to learn. And was theirs. By the time I returned home, the sky was already black. The porch light glared too bright, washing the doorway in a cold glow. Inside, the smell of dinner lingered, meatloaf, baked potatoes, gravy. The kind of meal I used to cook for my boy when he was small. The kitchen table was empty now, plates stacked in the sink. My son and his family had already eaten. A single plate sat off to the side, covered in foil. I pulled it back and found scraps, half a potato, the corner of meatloaf, vegetables pushed aside. It wasn't hunger that stung. It was the message. I sat at the counter, eating what was left, the hum of the refrigerator my only company. Upstairs, laughter carried down the hallway, muffled but sharp. My grandchildren's voices mixed with the TV. My daughter-in-law's laugh cut through it all, high and clear. I used to be part of that sound. Now I was just background noise. Later, I walked into the living room. My favorite chair had been moved, shoved against the wall to make space for a new recliner. His recliner. My spot at the end of the table, once mine by unspoken rule, now sat empty. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the chair that had carried me through countless evenings, holding a lifetime of tired bones. Then I lowered myself into the one by the wall. It creaked under me, too small, too stiff, foreign in my own home. The television played upstairs. The family photo on the mantel watched silently. My wife's smile seemed almost to fade in the dim light. I chewed slowly, swallowed carefully, as though each bite might stick in my throat. It wasn't food I was choking on, it was the weight of being unwanted. When the house finally grew quiet, I rose and cleaned the plate myself. No one came down. No one asked how my first day had gone. But that was fine. I didn't need their questions. I didn't need their approval. What they mistook for weakness was something else entirely. Patience. And patience, I knew, could be sharper than any blade. The second week at the community center felt easier. My hands moved with rhythm now, mop, rinse, sweep, repeat. The smell of bleach no longer clung so sharply. Work was work, and I knew how to work. That night, as I emptied a trash bin near the gym, a young woman paused on her way out. She wore scrubs, her badge still clipped to her pocket. A nurse, maybe. She held the door with one hand and looked back at me. "You do a good job here," she said. "The place is cleaner than I've ever seen it." I froze, the bag of trash in my grip. Compliments weren't something I'd expected in this uniform. She smiled, genuine, not hurried. "Reminds me of my dad," she added softly. "Hard-working. Reliable." For a second, I didn't know what to say. The words lodged in my throat, too heavy. I just nodded, and she walked out into the night. I stood there, still holding the trash, staring at the door she'd gone through. It wasn't much, just a passing comment. But it was more respect than I had received under my own roof in months. Later, in the lobby, a boy playing with a basketball accidentally dropped it. The ball rolled to my feet. I bent, picked it up, and handed it back. "Thanks, mister," he said quickly, running off. Two small words. Simple. But they lit something inside me. Because strangers saw what my own blood refused to see, I was still a man. Still capable. Still worthy of respect. When I left that night, the air was cold, but it felt cleaner in my lungs. My steps were steadier, shoulders less bent. They thought they had reduced me to a burden, to an extra mouth. But outside their house, in the world they thought was beneath me, people still saw my value. And that was enough to remind me of something I had almost forgotten. I was not finished. That night, after my shift, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I stopped at the park down the street. The benches were slick with frost, but I sat anyway, the cold wind pressing through my coat. I needed the quiet. From my pocket, I pulled out an old wallet, cracked leather, corners fraying. Tucked behind faded bills and a worn-out driver's license was a folded photograph. In it, I stood 25 years younger, beside the sign of a small auto shop. Miller & Son Repair. My arm around my boy, both of us grinning, grease on our hands. Back then, I had built something from nothing. Long days under the hood, nights balancing the books, weekends fixing engines when everyone else was resting. That shop had kept food on our table, shoes on his feet, and the mortgage paid. And when college came, I sold it. Sold the lifts, the tools, even the name. Every dollar went to his tuition. I told myself it was worth it, that his future was brighter than any shop lights I had ever stood beneath. I ran my thumb over the photograph, tracing the younger face of the man who used to believe sacrifice always bought gratitude. In the bottom of my wallet sat something else, a folded envelope, edges yellow with time. Inside were papers, deeds, insurance, contracts, things no one in that house seemed to remember. But I remembered. I kept every document, every signature. Because a man who builds knows the value of paper as much as the sweat on his brow. I slipped the envelope back into the wallet, tucked it deep. My son thought I was weak. That age had dulled me, that silence meant surrender. He didn't know the years had taught me patience, that my quiet was not emptiness but restraint. The shop was gone, but not everything had been erased. Some things were still mine. And when the time came, I would remind him. I rose from the bench, the photograph pressed against my palm, and walked back into the night. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, steady, measured. The past had not abandoned me. It was waiting. Upstairs, the walls in that house were thin. Thin enough for whispers to travel. One night, as I sat in the chair pushed against the wall, I heard them, my son and his wife, talking in the bedroom above. Their voices were low, but sharp enough to cut through the plaster. "We can't keep letting him stay here," she said. "The bills are too high. We need that space. Think of what we could do if we sold the house." There was a pause, then my son's voice, heavier, slower. "The deed is still in his name." Silence stretched, followed by her impatient sigh. "Then make him sign it over. He doesn't need it. He's old. He won't even know what he's giving up." The words slid down like poison, every syllable burning. I sat in the dark, staring at the family photo across the room. My own son, plotting like a stranger. My daughter-in-law, sharpening him like a knife. They thought age made me blind. That silence meant weakness. That patience meant ignorance. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let their words sink deep. So this was their plan: take the house, erase me from it, reduce me to a memory. But what they didn't know was that patience doesn't erase memory. It sharpens it. I remembered every paper I had signed, every bill I had paid, every line on the deed. I knew the weight of ink better than they did. Upstairs, the voices quieted. A door clicked shut. I sat there alone, the house colder than ever, but my mind steady. Greed blinds the greedy. And in their blindness, they had forgotten one simple truth. You can't steal from a man who still holds the key. It happened at church on a Sunday morning. The pews were full, sunlight streaming through stained glass, dust drifting in the beams. People greeted one another with handshakes and warm smiles, the kind reserved for old friends. I had barely settled into the back row when my son spotted me. His face tightened, as though my presence was an inconvenience, a stain on his otherwise polished image. During coffee hour, he stood with his wife among neighbors and family friends. Laughter rippled around them. Then someone, well-meaning, asked about me. "How's your dad doing?" My son's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He raised his voice just enough for the crowd to hear. "Dad? He's fine. We found him a little janitor job. Keeps him busy. Better than just sitting around, right?" The words carried across the room like a bell tolling. Heads turned. A few people laughed softly, uncertainly, unsure if it was a joke. My daughter-in-law chuckled outright, her hand resting proudly on my son's arm. I stood a few steps away, holding a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. The liquid trembled, rippling against the rim, though my hand stayed steady. No one looked at me directly, but I felt the weight of their glances. Pity. Amusement. That cruel curiosity people wear when they sense weakness. I didn't correct him. I didn't remind them all that the very house he lived in bore my name, paid for with my sweat and years. Instead, I lifted the cup, took a slow sip, and swallowed the bitter taste. Let them laugh. Because laughter fades, but paper endures. Across the room, a neighbor I'd known for decades shifted uncomfortably. He met my eyes, just for a second, and in that brief exchange I saw it, the flicker of respect, the silent acknowledgement that he knew there was more to the story. But my son didn't notice. He kept talking, louder now, bragging, as if humiliating me made him taller. The crowd moved on. Conversations shifted. My humiliation, to them, was just another piece of gossip to carry home. But to me, it was another stone placed carefully in the foundation of what was coming. Greed had made my son careless. Pride had made him cruel. And cruelty always leaves a trail. That evening, when the house had settled into silence, I went to my room. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, but the small desk in the corner still held what mattered. I slid open the bottom drawer and reached beneath the loose wood panel. My fingers found the edge of an envelope, yellowed with time but intact. I pulled it out slowly, brushing away the dust. Inside were papers I had kept for decades, insurance policies, bank records, and the one document that mattered more than any other, the deed. My name, clear as the day it was signed. My late wife's signature beside mine. Ink that could not be erased by whispers or greed. I unfolded the deed, the paper crackling in my hands. The weight of it was more than paper, it was history. It was sacrifice, every dollar scraped together from overtime shifts, every meal skipped to pay another bill. It was the roof that had sheltered my boy from storms, the walls that had heard his laughter when he was small. And now, it was my shield. They thought I had forgotten. They thought old age meant blindness, that silence meant surrender. They had no idea that every insult only reminded me to keep this safe. I placed the papers back into the envelope, tucking it carefully away. No need to show my hand yet. Revenge was not about speed, it was about timing. On the desk sat an old photo of my wife. Her smile was calm, knowing. I touched the frame lightly. "Not yet," I whispered. The laughter from upstairs drifted faintly through the ceiling, muffled but sharp. I closed the drawer and leaned back in the chair. They could mock me in public. They could feed me scraps, push me to the wall, call me a burden. But the truth was waiting. And when the day came, the silence they mistook for weakness would roar louder than their greed. The next afternoon, I left the house earlier than usual. My son thought I was heading to work, and I didn't correct him. let him believe what he wanted. Instead, I walked 3 blocks down to a small brick office with a fading sign, Harris and Company Law. The gold letters were chipped, but the man inside was steady as ever. Mr. Harris had been my lawyer years ago, back when I sold the repair shop to pay for my boy's college. He was older now, grayer, his glasses thicker, but his handshake was firm, and his eyes hadn't lost their sharpness. "Long time, John," he said, motioning me to sit. "What brings you back?" I set the envelope on his desk. The papers inside seemed to hum with their own weight. He opened it, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. Minutes passed in silence, only the sound of paper shifting. Finally, he looked up. "You kept everything," he said. His voice carried a note of respect. "I knew I'd need them one day," I replied. He leaned back, tapping the deed with one finger. "Legally, it's airtight. The house is still yours. No transfer. No loophole. If they've been telling people otherwise, they're lying." I nodded, the corner of my mouth tightening. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Nothing yet," I said. "Not until they try to take more than words. I want them to show their hand first." His eyebrows lifted. Then he smiled faintly, almost admiringly. "You always did play the long game." I rose, shook his hand, and slipped the envelope back into my coat. The weight on my chest felt lighter now, not gone, but steadier, as if I carried not just paper but armor. On the way out, I passed his secretary, a young woman tapping at her keyboard. She smiled warmly. "Take care, sir." Another simple kindness. Strange how strangers remembered respect while blood forgot it. Back on the sidewalk, the winter air bit into my face. I pulled my coat tighter and walked home. At the porch, I paused. Laughter drifted through the windows again. They didn't know where I'd been. They didn't know what I held. Let them laugh. Because when the time came, they wouldn't be laughing. A week later, the storm came, not the kind that rattles windows, but the kind that tears through families. I was sitting in the living room, the chair against the wall still creaking under me, when my son walked in holding a stack of papers. His wife trailed behind, arms folded, eyes sharp. He set the papers down on the coffee table with a thud. "Dad," he began, too casually, "we've been talking. It doesn't make sense for the house to stay in your name. You don't pay the bills anymore. We do. You should transfer it to us." I looked at the papers. Legal forms, quitclaim deeds, signatures already filled in where theirs belonged. The blank line at the bottom waited for me. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, her voice clipped. "It's just paperwork. Nothing changes. But this way, we can refinance, lower the mortgage, fix the place up. It's practical." Practical. That was the word they used for theft. I didn't answer right away. I picked up the first page, let my eyes drift over the lines. They thought I couldn't read the fine print. They thought age blurred more than vision. My son cleared his throat, irritation seeping in. "Dad, don't make this difficult. It's better for everyone. You don't need the stress. Just sign it." The pen was already on the table, placed neatly on top of the stack like bait on a hook. I set the paper back down, slow, deliberate. "Not tonight," I said. My voice was even, quiet. My daughter-in-law rolled her eyes. "We're trying to help you." But help wasn't what they offered. Control was. Ownership. A razor. My son's jaw tightened, his hand pressing flat on the table. "Think about it," he said, tone clipped. "But don't take too long. We can't keep carrying everything." They left the papers there, old in their assumption that I'd eventually fold. The door shut behind them, and the room sank into silence again. I stared at the documents, the pen glinting under the lamp. They thought patience meant compliance. But all patience really meant was waiting for the right moment. And mine was coming. It didn't take long for their frustration to spill into public view. The following Saturday, we attended a birthday party for a neighbor's little girl. The living room was crowded with balloons and laughter, the kind of noise that fills the air until it hums. I stood near the snack table, paper plate in hand, quiet, watching the children run circles around the furniture. That's when my daughter-in-law's voice rang out, sharper than the music. "Oh, don't mind him," she said to another guest who had tried to hand me a chair. "He's just tagging along. Doesn't really contribute much these days." The words landed heavy, casual as a joke but barbed with cruelty. A ripple of awkward chuckles followed. Some looked at their shoes. Others glanced at me, pity tugging at their faces. My son stood beside her, saying nothing, his silence its own agreement. I set the plate down carefully, though my hand ached to crush it. Inside, I felt the sting, sharp, immediate, but I let it settle like a stone sinking in water. On the surface, I stayed still. No outburst. No defense. Just the steady calm of a man who has carried heavier burdens. She laughed again, louder this time, as if humiliation could be entertainment. The children kept playing, oblivious. The music played on. But for the adults in the room, the air had shifted. The cruelty was no longer hidden behind closed doors, it was displayed like a trophy. I excused myself quietly, stepping outside into the cold evening air. The sky was gray, the kind that promised snow. I breathed deep, the chill biting at my lungs. They thought they had diminished me, that every public jab chipped away at my worth. But they misunderstood. Every insult, every humiliation, was just another match they struck against dry wood. They thought they were burning me down. What they didn't realize was that they were building the fire themselves. And when it caught, it wouldn't be me who turned to ash. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening. The house smelled faintly of reheated leftovers, the TV droning upstairs. I was at the kitchen table, sorting the day's mail, when my son walked in with a folder tucked under his arm. His wife followed close behind, her heels clicking sharp against the tile. He laid the folder down in front of me, his voice brisk. "Dad, it's time. We're selling the house." The words hung heavy in the air. I opened the folder. Inside were real estate listings, contracts already drawn up, even a business card from an agent. My chair at the table might as well have turned to ice. "We can get a good price now," my daughter-in-law added, her tone impatient. "The market's hot. We need to move fast." I looked at the papers spread before me, photos of my home, rooms I had built with my own hands, laid out like merchandise in a catalog. "Sign the transfer," my son said, tapping the line at the bottom. "It'll make the process smooth. Less trouble for everyone." I studied his face. There was no shame, no hesitation. Only greed dressed up as logic. For the first time in weeks, I straightened in my chair, shoulders squaring. My hands didn't tremble when I pushed the papers back toward him. "Not tonight," I said evenly. His jaw tightened. "Dad." I raised a hand, cutting him off. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of surrender anymore. It was the silence of a line being drawn. My daughter-in-law scoffed. "You're being stubborn. You owe us. After everything we've done for you." Her words trailed into the air, but I no longer absorbed them. Instead, I heard the echo of my lawyer's voice in my memory, airtight, still yours, no loopholes. For the first time, I let a smile flicker at the corner of my mouth. Small, controlled, deliberate. They didn't notice. They only saw resistance, not the beginning of a storm. I rose slowly from the table, gathering the mail, leaving their folder untouched. "I'll think about it," I said, my tone quiet but final. I walked away, my footsteps steady, the weight of the envelope in my coat pocket grounding me with every step. They thought they had cornered me. What they didn't see was that in pushing me this far, they had opened the door to their own undoing. The showdown came sooner than they expected. It was a Saturday morning, bright with winter sun, when my son gathered the family in the living room. His wife hovered by his side, arms crossed, chin high. The grandchildren sat awkwardly on the couch, sensing something was wrong. A real estate agent stood near the doorway, clutching a leather folder, eyes darting nervously between us. My son cleared his throat, papers in hand. "Dad, this is it. We've lined everything up. The buyers are ready. All that's left is your signature." He pushed the stack across the coffee table toward me, the pen resting neatly on top. The room was still. Even the clock seemed to pause between ticks. I looked at the papers, contract stamped, signatures in place, dollar amount scrolled in ink. My home reduced to numbers on a page. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the envelope I had kept hidden for decades. The edges were worn, the paper yellowed, but the seal was intact. Their eyes followed it as I laid it on the table. Slowly, I opened it and unfolded the deed. My name. My wife's name. Signatures clear, ink sharp despite the years. The agent frowned, leaning closer. My son's wife stiffened, her smirk faltering. "What's this?" my son asked, his voice rising. This, I said quietly, is the only signature that matters. I slid the deed across the table, right on top of the contracts they had prepared. The agent picked it up, scanning the lines, and his face changed, confusion first, then dawning recognition. "Sir," he said carefully, looking at my son, "your father's right. Legally, the property is still his. There's no transfer, no trust, no joint ownership. Without his approval, nothing moves forward." The color drained from my son's face. His wife's lips parted, a protest forming but dying before it reached sound. The grandchildren stared, eyes wide, as if they were watching a scene they'd never forget. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady, my hands folded in my lap. "You wanted me to sign?" I said. "Consider this my answer." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. The real estate agent closed his folder awkwardly, muttered something about miscommunication, and hurried out the door. My son stood frozen, jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. His wife glared at me, fury twisting her face, but behind the anger was fear. Because in that moment, the truth was undeniable: the house was mine. Always had been. Always would be, until I decided otherwise. The fallout began immediately. That evening, the phone call started. The real estate agent, embarrassed and wary, called to say he would no longer be involved. "Too many complications," he muttered, his voice tight with discomfort. I could almost hear him packing away their dream commission. My daughter-in-law stormed through the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors, muttering about lost opportunities and ruined chances. My son trailed behind her, his voice low, urgent, angry. But the anger wasn't aimed at me anymore, it was aimed at each other. I sat in my chair, the deed resting quietly in my lap. I didn't need to speak. Their words turned sharper, louder, bouncing off the walls like broken glass. "You said he'd sign," she snapped. "You promised me this would be clean." "Don't put this on me," my son fired back. "You're the one who pushed." Their voices tangled, accusations spilling, greed unraveling into blame. By the next week, the bills caught up with them. The mortgage payment was late. The credit cards stretched thin. The extra mouth they once accused me of being turned out to be the only steady piece of the house. And when the neighbors whispered, it wasn't about me anymore. It was about them. Tried to sell the house out from under their father. Can you believe that? Shameful. The whispers grew, finding their way into church pews, grocery aisles, PTA meetings. Reputation, once polished, now stained. My son avoided my eyes at breakfast, his shoulders hunched, pride collapsing in on itself. His wife still glared, but the confidence had drained from her smirk. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded the deed back into its envelope and tucked it safely away. Every insult they had thrown, every scrap they had left me, every attempt to erase me, it all slid back onto their plates, heavier than any debt. Consequences aren't loud. They don't need to be. They creep in quietly, like frost on a window, until the whole pane is covered and the cold can't be ignored. And as I watched them scramble, I realized justice didn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes, it settled like snow, soft, steady, undeniable. It was Sunday again when the whispers grew too loud to ignore. Church was full, the pews crowded with familiar faces. I sat in the back, as I always did. My son and his wife arrived late, moving quickly up the aisle, their smile stretched too thin. People turned as they passed, nodding politely, but the warmth was gone. During coffee hour, I stayed near the window, sipping weak coffee from a styrofoam cup. Conversation swirled, but one by one, eyes began to flick toward them. Mrs. Carter, who had lived next door for 30 years, broke the silence first. "I heard you tried to sell your father's house," she said flatly. Her words landed with the weight of a gavel. Heads turned. Cups froze halfway to lips. My daughter-in-law laughed too loudly, waving a dismissive hand. People love to gossip. It wasn't like that. But my son's face betrayed him. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted toward me, then away. Another neighbor stepped in. "The real estate agent told my husband. Said you pushed contracts through without your father's consent." Murmurs rippled through the room, sharp and relentless. Shameful. Disgrace. How could they? I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I just stood with my coffee, calm, steady, letting the silence say what words could not. The children tugged at their mother's sleeve, confused by the tension. My son tried to defend himself, his voice cracking under the weight of too many eyes. It was just paperwork. We thought. Thought what? Mrs. Carter cut in. That no one would notice? That he didn't matter? The room buzzed, judgment thick in the air. For once, the smirks were gone. My daughter-in-law's cheeks flushed crimson, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. My son looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his shoulders slumped, pride leaking out like air from a punctured tire. I set my cup down slowly, deliberately. Every eye followed me as I straightened. I'm fine, I said quietly. Always have been. No more words were needed. The truth was already laid bare, and the community had passed its verdict. When we left the church, the air outside was crisp, almost sharp. My son walked ahead, his wife pulling at his arm, whispering frantically. No one rushed to greet them. No one lingered to chat. But a few old friends stopped me on the steps. They pressed my hand, nodded firmly, whispered, "Good for you. Justice, finally." I only smiled faintly, my breath misting in the cold air. Justice didn't need a courtroom. Sometimes, it needed only a room full of neighbors with eyes wide open. And today, every eye had seen. The house was silent that evening. No laughter, no slammed doors, no clatter from the kitchen. Just silence, the kind that follows a storm after it has stripped the trees bare. I sat in my chair against the wall, the one they thought had been my corner of defeat. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a throne built from patience. Upstairs, I heard muffled voices. My son and his wife argued in hushed tones, the words sharp, clipped, desperate. Bills. Reputation. Embarrassment. The words floated down like ashes from a fire they had started themselves. I didn't interrupt. I didn't climb those stairs. I didn't need to. Instead, I folded the deed once more, slipped it into its envelope, and tucked it safely inside my coat pocket. It had never left me, not once, and now it never would. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the silence wash over me. It wasn't the silence of humiliation anymore. It was the silence of victory. Because triumph doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it looks like an old man sitting quietly, while those who mocked him scramble in the wreckage of their own greed. My son passed through the living room once, pausing at the edge as if he wanted to speak. His mouth opened, then closed again. He kept walking. I didn't stop him. Words weren't necessary. He already knew. In that stillness, I smiled. Not wide, not gloating, just enough to feel it in the corners of my mouth. The revenge they never saw coming wasn't anger, wasn't shouting, wasn't rage. It was silence. And in silence, I had won. The days that followed were quieter. Not empty, just quieter, as though the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. My son avoided me now. He moved through the rooms like a shadow, shoulders hunched, words clipped and few. His wife barely looked my way, her eyes hard but tired, the fire drained from her voice. The grandchildren, though, still found me. They drifted into my corner, asking about my stories, laughing at the way I could still mimic the growl of an old car engine. Children don't carry grudges the way adults do. They just look for warmth, and I had plenty left to give. I began walking each morning, coat buttoned tight against the cold. Neighbors I'd known for decades waved from their porches. Some stopped to shake my hand, their grip firm, their eyes clear with respect. Their nods told me what I already knew. Word had spread. The truth had taken root, and my dignity had been restored, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by standing still until the storm collapsed under its own weight. At home, I cooked my own meals again. Simple things, soup simmering on the stove, bread warming in the oven. The kitchen smelled alive in a way it hadn't for months. I ate at the table, not at the counter, not in the corner. My chair reclaimed its place at the head, without a word needing to be said. I didn't push them out. I didn't seek revenge beyond what had already been served. Life had a way of teaching lessons sharper than any lecture. They now lived under the roof they had tried to steal, reminded every day whose name was written on the deed tucked safely in my drawer. One evening, as snow fell thick outside the window, my grandson asked, "Grandpa, why do you always smile when you're quiet?" I looked at him, his eyes wide, innocent. I ruffled his hair gently and said, "Because sometimes silence says more than shouting ever could." And with that, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like mine again, steady, warm, and, for the first time in a long while, at peace. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. I learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in casual words, tossed across a dinner table like scraps. And justice, true justice, doesn't always thunder in with fists and fury. Sometimes it waits in silence, steady as a stone, patient as time. My son and his wife had called me a burden, an extra mouth. They had forgotten the years of sacrifice, the foundation I had laid beneath their very feet. But the truth has a way of rising, even when people try to bury it. I didn't fight them with anger. I didn't match insult for insult. I let them believe they had won, until the moment came when the truth spoke louder than their lies. A single envelope, a simple deed, carried more weight than all their schemes combined. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the quiet dignity of a man who refuses to break. Sometimes it speaks in the steady silence of a father who knows patience will always outlast greed. And in the end, that silence became my greatest weapon. To anyone listening, remember this: family can wound you deeper than strangers, but betrayal never erases worth. The value of a life, of sacrifice, of love given freely, those things cannot be signed away. A house can be sold. Money can change hands. But respect? Respect is earned, and once lost, it leaves a scar no contract can hide. So when you hear laughter at your expense, or feel the sting of being cast aside, hold your silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of strength. Let patience do its work. Because betrayal cuts deep, yes, but justice always finds its way. And as for me, I sit in my chair, the deed safe where it belongs, the house warm around me. I smile quietly, not out of bitterness, but because the lesson has been written clear. Silence, when held with truth, always speaks the loudest.